Welcome to this webcast on the Psychology of Gifted Adults, Part 1. This is the first in a series of 3 webcasts, all of which are available on this site. Much of the content for this series was originally filmed live in Lake Charles, Louisiana at the 50th anniversary reunion of the Governor's Program for Gifted Children in July 2008. I'm Cal Domang, marriage and family therapist, psychotherapist, and alumnus of the program. The original audience for this presentation consisted of program alumni, many of whom I know personally, so the presentation style is informal and interactive. The content, however, is drawn from solid psychological theory and research. All sources are included at the end of the final webcast in this series. At times, you'll notice that additional information has been spliced into the original recording. This occurs when there were technical problems or when topics warranted further clarification. In this first webcast, I present an overview of the entire series, clarify the scope of the presentation, and comment about the relevance of psychology in general and specifically how it relates to the gifted population. I then present relevant components of 3 theories of psychology and development: Erikson, Dabrowski, and Linehan. In parts 2 and 3 of this series, I relate these specifically to the gifted population and present research on various aspects of how giftedness manifests throughout the lifespan. This webcast begins with an introduction by Mary Ellen Roy, an alumnus of the program and member of the organizing committee for the reunion.
Talking about everybody doing everything, as someone said, Zart kept us all going. We started with conference calls. Those in such huge fights, we had to stop conference calls. And, she had to talk to everyone individually, and she talked to this person, and she talked to that person. Is that okay? Is that okay? Then she announced miraculously the warring factions have come to an agreement. And she's kept it all going all throughout, and so we all, of course, owe Zart a tremendous round of applause. Also owe Jeff, since he walked in, because I'm sure while she was doing that, I'm sure she was, he could see her tearing around. I'm really excited about this presentation. I'm going to be introducing Cal Domang, but I also want to say a little about how this came about. A few years ago, a friend of mine who has a profoundly gifted child mentioned to me, wanted to find you of an organization called SENG, which stands for Supporting the Emotional Needs of the Gifted. And I said no, and I looked into it, and I learned a lot about gifted children and gifted adults. I always thought that it meant that we were, smart. I mean, like we thought faster than some people or whatever, but that, other than being able to, maybe we're more logical, that was sort of it. And I learned through doing a lot of reading in the last few years that there's a whole constellation of emotional characteristics that are characteristics of gifted people. I mean, I think I knew that we were, intense and excitable, maybe, but I didn't know maybe. And sensitive, her feelings, But I really hadn't put it all together, and I've learned a lot about that since then. And I've been to the conference of this organization, and I'll give them a plug because they really are excellent. It's their website is www.sing, S-E-N-G, gifted, so singgifted.org, and there are lots of journal articles and so forth. And I went to their conference last year and heard a lot about the emotional and social needs and characteristics of gifted children and gifted adults. And it was such a wonderful experience for me to learn more about myself and my children and my husband and my friends that I thought if we were having another reunion, I'd really love to have us talk about that and learn more about that, because it's been such a revelation for me. And some of you probably already knew all that or have known about it, but some of you maybe like me really didn't know. So Cal Domang, I've known Cal since we were 12. He's a few years old. He's 2-3 years older than me, and I'm not even sure. We're trying to figure out if we overlap. We're not even sure we overlapped at the program. We don't overlap yet.
Y'all didn't.
And I knew the kids who were a year or two, a little older than me in Lafayette, and kids a little younger. And a little about him. He's done a lot of things in his life. I mean, he's a terrific singer and musician, and he's also done computer. He's an IT person, and I can't tell you exactly what he's done because I'm not an IT person at all, but we used to have computer support for, that was called Computer Associates, and now it's called CA, and that is still, I think, part of what he does is to do that. But then also a few years ago, he went to school to learn about psychotherapy and to become a psychotherapist, and he is a licensed marriage and family therapist in California. And of course, he's going through some spiritual journeys and so forth, which you may or may not talk about. But so I thought, well, and Zart and I talked, we thought it would be wonderful to have. My initial thought was I'd have someone from the outside, some expert to come in and sort of tell us about us, but then we realized we had someone in our own midst who could tell us about us. And so Cal is going to give a presentation, which she wonderfully put on PowerPoint for us. And then after this, there's more, fun and games and the drama for those who want to go to that. But also immediately afterward, for those of you who want to continue the conversation with Cal about some of the issues he raised, I don't want to call it a seminar, but we'll move over to the Sycamore room. And for those who want to play back alley, great, or risk, great. But if you want to we'll go in a corner and talk more about some of these issues, then we're going to do that too. So without further ado, Cal Doman.
Thank you for that glowing and wonderful introduction, Mary Ellen. I'm going to try a little experiment here, which I didn't think to do earlier. Does this come off of the stand? Yeah. Okay. Do I just pull out? Thank you. I hate to be tied in one place. So I'm going to wander around a bit. So Mary Ellen has explained a lot about kind of me and how this presentation came about. I'll expand on it slightly, and I'll explain later why I'm expanding on it slightly. So I graduated from, I'm a graduate of the program in 1970. I went to USL, now UL. I have a dual major. I finished a BA in mathematics, a BS in mathematics, and a BMP, Bachelor of Music Performance in Voice. Went to Houston for a few years, worked at being a professional singer, sang with the Houston Opera in the chorus there for several years. Then moved to San Francisco, worked in IT, which I still do. I'm a principal technical support engineer for CA, as you mentioned. And I'm now a marriage and family therapist. Along the way, I also got ordained as a minister. I'm also a licensed shiatsu acupuncturist, but please don't form a line. And I think those are probably most of my credentials that I've got. So the reason I'm putting this out there is that I think the fact that we are gifted is confusing to a lot of people. And I'll talk a little bit later about how the different forms in which giftedness can manifest. And I am clearly at one end of the spectrum, which I'll point out to you later, so that's why I'm mentioning all this stuff. So, without further ado, let's plunge in. A couple thoughts though. I know that the setup is not ideal. If any of you want to take the chairs and move around the room, if you actually want to see the screen, please feel free to do so. If you need to get up and eat or have dessert, I will never stand between a person and their chocolate, so go for it.
We paid for all this food already,
so please don't feel nailed to your chair. I will not be offended if you move around. I will have time for questions at the end. And I'm very responsive to hand signals or, heads nodding. So, feel free to let me know if I need to move more quickly or slowly or whatever. So this is going to be our agenda for today. I'll talk, just introduce a little more about what we're talking about and the particular point of view that I've adopted for this presentation. Then we'll go into some basics about psychology. I don't know really what your background is, and I thought it might be interesting to talk about this in a somewhat thorough way within the time that we have. So I'm going to give a little intro to a couple of different aspects of psychology, and then we'll talk a little bit about gifted psychology. And then we'll talk about gifted psychology and gifted folks in the real world, like once you get out of school and stop getting all those awards for how smart we are. And then we'll wrap up later. So I'd like to start with just a few questions to give me a sense of who you guys are and who I'm talking to. So I'll know a little bit about how to tailor this as we go along. So first, how many licensed psychotherapists?
I'm had therapy to all.
Okay. We'll give you the mic later. Okay. How many of you in the room have some exposure to theories of psychotherapy? Any class in psychology, psychotherapy of your own, anything like that? Okay, a good number of you, great. How many are guests here today? Spouses, other guests, that sort of thing? Okay, so the rest of you are all alumni, I'm assuming. Great. And last question, how many GPC graduates are in the room? Let me just get a show of hands. Okay, great, thank you. And I think this is the last question. How many of you in the room are gifted? No, seriously, I want you to take a look around the room. I asked a very simple question, and I see maybe 18 hands. And yet everyone in this room qualifies. So to me, this is one of the challenges of being gifted, is that very often we have a very mixed relationship with that aspect of ourselves. You know, if I say this, am I bragging? If I say this, will somebody tease me? You know, there's a lot of reaction to it. So just asking a simple question, are you gifted? You know, what do I say that question? So we'll be talking a little bit more about that later. Okay, so let me just give you a few disclaimers about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about a few specific ideas and theories about psychology and human development and how they're going to apply to gifted folks. I'm doing this simply to provide food for thought, grist for the mill, as Ram Dass would say. I'm putting these out as offerings in case you find them interesting or provocative or helpful. And it's very much in the spirit of take what you like and leave the rest. And the format that I've adopted, even though the topic is psychology and gifted adults, is pretty much over the lifespan of a gifted person, with a bit of a focus on the adult. And part of the reason for that is that a lot of the research has been done with kids, and so not a lot has been done with adults. So we'll kind of see how that plays out later. Despite what Mary Ellen mentioned, today's presentation does not try to tell you who you are, or suggest who you should be. And my personal bias in psychotherapy is that I don't claim to be in any way more expert about your life than anyone that I know. You are the experts about your life. I have a certain training and background and some information that I will put out there, and if you find it helpful, then I'm glad about that. My personal bias, which also comes into this, is that I think in approaching life, it's really important to adopt what Suzuki Roshi called Zen mind, beginner's mind. He said, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. So even though people sometimes refer to me as an expert, usually in my computer job as opposed to psychology, I usually disavow that label simply because to me that means someone who thinks they know everything, and I'm so clear about what I do not know. So that today I'm putting out some stuff, but it's definitely from this point of view. I also want to just debunk a bit the myth of the therapist as an expert. So a lot of people go, ooh, he's a therapist, he must know all this stuff. Is he watching me now? So I want to very clearly say, I'm not where I'm coming from. I do think, however, that personal transformation can be hugely rewarding and make an amazing difference in one's life. And I think it's really possible through insight, through self-reflection. And I think it's really important, this is a bit of my Buddhist background, to remember that insight without compassion is cruelty. That's a very old Buddhist saying, and I found it to be incredibly true. So I think the power of compassion is just amazing. So those are the main caveats that we're approaching it with today. So let's plunge forward into our content. I want to give a little bit of context. This is only for me, so I'm sure there are neuroscientists and biologists in the room who may disagree with me, and that's totally fine. Where I'm coming from is that biology is basically talking about the structure and the anatomy of the brain. Physiology is a bit about the working of the brain, kind of how things go together, what happens when, that sort of thing. I see psychology as kind of the intersection of those two things, along with a little bit of environmental influences. So it's a lot about why things work. It depends a lot on the biology that we're born with in terms of our brain chemistry and our brain structure. And it does have some relation with one's environment, but a lot of it is about the brain. So unfortunately, my technical skills with PowerPoint hit a limit. So I have a few videos that I'm going to show you guys, but we're just going to have to bounce back and forth. So here we go with the first one.
Like our other organs, the brain has evolved, increasing over millions of years in complexity and information content. Its structure reflects all the stages through which it has passed. The brain has evolved from the inside out. Deep inside is the oldest part, the so-called brain stem. It conducts many of the basic biological functions, including the rhythms of life, like heartbeat and respiration. The higher functions of the brain have evolved in 3 successive stages, according to a provocative insight by the American biologist Paul MacLean. You see, capping the brainstem is the so-called R complex, R for reptile. It's the seat of aggression, ritual, territoriality, and social hierarchies. It evolved some hundreds of millions of years ago in our reptilian ancestors. So deep inside our brain is something rather like the brain of a crocodile. Surrounding the R complex is the limbic system, or mammal brain. It evolved some tens of millions of years ago in ancestors who were mammals, all right, but not yet primates like monkeys or apes. It's a major source of our moods and emotions, our concern and care for the young. And then finally, on the outside of the brain, living in a kind of uneasy truce with the more primitive brains beneath, is the cerebral cortex, evolved millions of years ago in ancestors who were primates. This is the point of embarkation for all our cosmic journeys, the cerebral cortex, where matter is transformed into consciousness. Here, comprising more than 2/3 of the brain mass, is the realm both of intuition and of critical analysis. It's here that we have ideas and inspirations, here that we read and write, here that we do mathematics and music. The cortex regulates our conscious lives. It is the distinction of our species, the seat of our humanity. Art and science live here. Civilization is a product of the cerebral cortex.
Cool. So we'll have a few of those little videos, so if you want to take naps during your presentation, do it then, okay? So you can hear it. Thank you. So let's expand a little bit on the definition of psychology. First of all, Wikipedia calls it a phenomenological and scientific study of mental processes and behavior. In my experience, the application of it is really a blend of science and art. There's definitely a lot of research and science that's gone into it, but how to apply it definitely is different from every practitioner you approach and every school you go to. And I thought I was back in the slideshow, sorry. There we go, it's better. So it's basically the exploration of consciousness, and one of my favorite phrases is the unexamined life is not worth living by Plato, as quoted by Madonna. Wonderful combination. And it's a lot about how one can expand one's potential, and it really can foster greater self-realization. In my experience, it goes by a lot of different names. And in fact, it is a very young science. So in my experience, it works best when coupled with a lot of our ancient wisdom traditions. So just to look a bit at how young the field of psychology is, I have a brief timeline here for you. So if you think that just a little over a century ago is when Freud started his whole developing of psychoanalysis, and literally just maybe 108 years ago he wrote The Interpretation of Dreams, which was when the first suggestion of the idea of the unconscious was presented, and the subconscious. And that's such a part of our reality today in terms of how we think about our perspectives about the brain. It's kind of amazing to think in terms of our history as a race. It's really a relatively new concept. There's a few other things I've noted here. Erickson's Childhood and Society was 1950, so some of us in the room are older than this theory. And it talks a lot about stages of development, which I'll be talking a bit about today. Kamyet-Dabrowski in 1964, even more recent, wrote this theory of positive disintegration, which I think has great application to us, we as gifted people. And in 1980s, really, really recent. Is anybody in the room born after 1980? Yeah. Okay. So there's still a few. But probably not, it's probably close to your birth year. But anyway, that's when postmodern psychology came along, which brought around the whole idea of how we define ourselves can be a matter of choice. It can be a matter of our perspective. How we think about ourselves can frame our reality. So a lot of these things are really new. I just want to split up that timeline just for a minute. to interweave a few other things about gifted folks. So you'll notice here, starting in 1918 was the first gifted program, but then there was a gap of quite a while. 1924 and 1926 were the first real publications about gifted education. And 1958 was the first funding for any type of giftedness. And then there was a big gap. And then only in the 1970s, 20 years later, was there a governmental focus that returned to that. And the organization that Mary Ellen mentioned, which is basically the preeminent organization in this field today, SANG, was founded just a little over 20 years ago, 27 years ago. The Louisiana School, which some of you may have attended, was founded only in 1982. And so you'll see the journals and giftedness and things like that, very, very recent. That's the point I'm trying to make. And of course, here in the middle of the time frame are events very important to us, the founding of the program. I think that one of the reasons I wanted to put this in perspective for you was just to point out that many people had the idea and the concept of Louisiana as a fairly backward state. I won't comment on that. But I do think it's important to note that in the field of gifted education, the Governor's Program and the Louisiana School were among the first residential gifted programs in the nation. So we actually have a very long and proud tradition of recognizing gifted folks in this state and finding and providing at least these opportunities for them. Okay, so in terms of psychology, there's 3 different theories I'm going to talk about a bit today. And here they are. So the first is Erik Erikson. He talks about stages of development, and I'll go through those in a minute. The second is this guy Dabrowski that I mentioned, and he talks about something called positive disintegration, and that involves basically personal evolution or personal development via this thing that he calls positive disintegration. And a big factor in that is what he calls overexcitability, which has all these concepts, by the way, are applicable to the population at large, but we're going to take a little twist and look at how they focus on us, because don't we all like to talk about ourselves? And I'll talk a little bit toward the end about Marcia Linehan and her dialectical behavior theory, behavior therapy, because I think it's got some relevance here as well. So just to be really, really clear, as a disclaimer, I'm not going to attempt to do a college course on these three people in 20 minutes, although you could probably all manage that. We're just going to get the key concept on a few of them. So let's start with Erikson. He basically talks about stages of development in life, and those stages are physical, emotional, psychological. He relates each stage to particular developmental tasks, what we learn as individuals in order to grow, in order to fit in with society, in order to become productive human beings. Each of these stages has estimates of age, but the ages can vary quite widely, and it can be a really non-linear progression in many ways. So just to run through these briefly, these are his first 4 stages, there are 8. He talks about infant to birth, and he says the main thing that a person needs to learn there is trust, and it's a very basic sense of trust. Will the world continue to exist tomorrow? Will mommy still be here when I look back at her and walk away? Things like that. Do I, as a person, continue to exist after I go to sleep? Really fundamental trust in that sense. As a toddler, you're learning to trust yourself, not in the existential sense of the first stage, but more in the world. Can I explore the world? Can I walk away? And will things still be there when I come back? Play age, learning to plan and do things on one's own, getting dressed, learning how to do things, learning how to sort of be a little more independent in the world. And then school age, where we start to develop our sense of personal identity, largely by comparing ourselves to others. And this is where it gets really interesting for gifted folks, which we'll look at later. But the thing that Erikson said about this stage is that we mainly establish a sense of self-worth via our industry, via our accomplishments. Adolescence, he goes on to say, is about identity versus role confusion. And if any of you think about middle school and high school and how that whole self-questioning, who am I, where do I fit in, who am I like, who am I not like, what group am I fit in with? I see most of the women in the group nodding. They have a different experience in this, I think, than men. But it's true for all of us. A key point that Erikson makes is that before this stage of adolescence, who we are really depends mostly on what people have done to us, the influences of our parents, our teachers, things like that. Around this age, our self-awareness and self-consciousness is at the point where we can actually take over and marshal our resources in terms of developing who we are on our own. He also makes a point of saying not everyone does that. So this is the point where personal choice and personal awareness come into play in a very, very big way. And so I'll be talking more about that later. So some of the rest of these stages, not everyone in the room has reached. So these are some things that you have to look forward to. So the young adult stage is where he says, can we go next? And he says the main task there is about intimacy, solidarity with oneself, versus isolation. And he says at this age we start to figure out, can we actually pair up with people? Who do we want to pair up with? Intimacy, certainly in the sexual and physical sense, but also just in the emotional sense. How do we form relationships with people and negotiate the boundaries between us in an effective way where we can sort of dissolve our walls and let someone in and then rebuild those walls when we don't want that? How do we master that art? In middle age, he talks a lot about, it's a time of generativity. What are you creating? What's your output? What's your production? Not so much in the, work or how are you earning your living kind of thing, although that's some of it. But he says a lot of one's sense of accomplishment comes through what we do. And if we fail to do those things, then we may come to a place of stagnation if we don't have a sense of our accomplishments. In the end of life, in stages, he talks about ego integrity versus despair. Do we end our lives with a sense of ourselves as intact? Are we happy and at peace with what we've accomplished and where we've gone in our lives? Or do we dissolve into a place of despair because we are not happy with how things have gone? So those are his basic stages. We'll come back to them later in terms of how we go to, how we apply those to this group of people. So bear with me, I'm just going to kind of plow through these. Dabrowski is a little less well known, partly because he's more recent. So I'm going to try to explain this as simply as I can. He says that growth in the sense of personal development is entirely optional. He says we all start as very egocentric and conformist individuals, and our choice over life is to evolve into someone who is more giving, more humanitarian, less self-centered in terms of our life. And he says the way that this happens is because we're all born sort of conformist and self-centered. Our first drives are to take care of ourselves, to get food, to figure out how to survive, all that sort of thing. So he says the way that we evolve from this really self-focused person into a sense of what do we have to give to the world and what's our contribution happens by disintegrating any preconceptions we have about how we fit in and who we are and what we can contribute. And those disintegrations come in the form of challenges. And those challenges can result in dramatic changes. Some of those dramatic changes are not positive, so people cannot integrate new information or feedback. It can result in psychosis, suicide, a whole bunch of messy things. But as you progress, he says you can see it as a form of transformation. And he says there's a couple of prerequisites for this journey to actually happen. One is a facilitative social environment, and the second is what he calls development potential, which he has a very specific definition for. And it's related to this thing that he talks about overexcitabilities, and this is a little bit about what Mary Ellen was mentioning in terms of intensity, which sometimes happens. So, this overexcitability, as he refers to it, basically is a neurological or physiological thing. It refers to the speed at which, the depth of which our neurons can process information and our nervous system responds to stimuli. So if you think about the fact that we are gifted, which means that something in our brains works a little differently than a lot of people, maybe faster, maybe more intuitively, maybe different ways, it means that our neurons are working a little differently. So he's saying if we take his theory for it, that means it not only applies to our brains, it applies to all of our nervous system, which means we could have this overexcitability, as he calls it, in these 5 different areas. So I want to just take another brief little audience poll in a minute. So does everybody have a sense of what I'm talking about here, or are you completely lost? I see that no one's head is hitting the table yet, so that's a good sign. Okay. So in terms of these ways that overexcitabilities can manifest, he says there's 5 basic ways it happens. Psychomotor, so really a drive, energy, just a restlessness, a go, 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 and a person who can do a lot of things. A sensualness, so a real in touch with your physical body. It may be sexual, but it may also be athletic or other things like that. Imaginational, so people who are particularly creative or have very vivid fantasy lives, maybe are inventors. Intellectual would be anyone who simply loves ideas and theories and loves exploring ideas and, ooh, where's that thought going to go and what's that connected to? Just the love of knowledge and discovery, questioning. And the 5th is what he calls emotional overexcitability. So either a great emotional depth or intensity, a wide range of feelings, great capacity for compassion, for identifying with others. That also comes often with a sense of heightened responsibility, not necessarily in the codependent sense of, oh, I have to take care of everyone that I have ever met in my entire life, but in the sense of, maybe I have more to give here, maybe I should think about making contributions to other people. So, he says, this is a quote from Dabrowski, that overexcitabilities, when they exist in the heightened range, can often cause a person to experience day-to-day life more intensely and to feel the extremes of the joys and sorrows of life profoundly. So I want to just take another little audience poll, if I may. So if you're kind of getting the general gist of this, how many of you in the room identify with one and only one of these 5 drives? How many with 2? How many with 3? How many with 4? How many with 5?
80.
How many identify particularly with the last 3? Okay.
If you haven't already done so while listening to this webcast, take a moment and reflect on these 5 categories. Note how many of these you relate to in terms of your life history and your personality tendencies. Also notice which ones in particular seem meaningful or relevant to you or people you know.
Dabrowski's theory was that the last 3 in particular are often manifest in the gifted population. But there were, I don't know if you were all looking around the room when I was asking you to raise your hands, but most of the people in the room identify with 3 or more of these, which I think lends great credibility to this theory. He talks about dynamisms. I'm not really sure how much to go into this, but basically this is what I was talking about earlier. So this is a dynamism in his mind would be the forces that allow you to recover from these life challenges. So they might be a biological drive, an emotional capacity, something that will help you to make a shift. Now some of these dynamisms are actually what he would call negative experiences. So intense feelings of shame or guilt or confusion can drive one to change one's sense of oneself. And he said those chronic, intense negative emotions actually play a really important part in helping us to become aware of these implicit worldviews or the assumptions, the preconceptions by which we may live, so that we can then challenge them or decide what to do about that. He talked about something called autopsychotherapy, which doesn't mean you can't still have a therapist and come to see people like me, but it does mean you can have the ability to sort of take control of one's development and have sort of a sense of guiding your own life. Oops, sorry, let me go back a sec. So I just have a couple of examples here. So, because this, I think, gets a little complex at times. So one example would be perhaps, maybe you might know someone that this applies to, where they were young, they were told that being smart was good, and that was really reinforced by their teachers and their parents. Then they went to school, and they met people their same age. Exactly, and that's when the problem happens. So, people of the same age, age peers would tease a person like this if they were extremely smart. They might bully them. So that then causes a challenge to one's self-concept, from being self-smart being good to, well, wait, what does this mean? Is this a bad thing? I feel ashamed, I'm confused. So a lot of people have very intense emotional reactions to this, maybe feel torn. And that can go a number of different ways. It can internalize as self-doubt, as depression, different things like that. Or with support or some self-examination or perhaps some coaching, you can examine that perspective and simply see it for what it is. So you might come to see that this person who was doing the teasing, maybe they are an idiot, we're not going to necessarily say they're not, but the reason that they're teasing may have nothing to do with that. It may simply be that they're insecure or they're envious. And are they feeling inadequate themselves? And the only way they can find to value themselves is to put the other person down, to make them feel outside. So if you can think of it from that way, a person may then develop a sense of compassion for their tormentors and say, well, what they're saying is just their perspective. They don't know who I am. Whatever they think about being smart, I don't have to take that on. So then one can renew one's sense of self with a different sense of regard for your intellect, for your sense of pride in self, that sort of thing. So similar, does that sort of make sense? Does it resonate at all? So it's kind of that experience of something in the world impinging on one's sense of self, causing an emotional reaction. That emotional reaction can then stir one to sort of examine the concepts and preconceptions with which we're raised and reshape not only how you see yourself, but then how you can take that sense of self forth into the world. Okay? So the question was, what if it's about like 10 to 1 or 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1 and it's all the time? Well, Dabrowski would say, I think, not to quote him, but I think Dabrowski would say that, that's a lot of what we in this room have experienced. And we obviously have survived it. But he would say that that's a very intense challenge. So it would probably require more support from the outside, more sense of peer relationships, to help one through that time, more of a sense of not being alone, to help one through that challenge. So the intensity of the challenge with which you're faced has to be matched in some way by intensity, by something to help you get through that. So as an adult, you may face similar processes to these. If a boss or coworkers is teasing you and says, hey, what are you doing? Why are you working so hard? We don't have to do that. That can challenge one's sense of productivity as well. Also, any way in which one is different, if one is gay, lesbian, or if you have a mental handicap, or if you come from a household where there's a lot of alcoholism or dysfunction, any way in which you're different can cause this similar kind of intense emotional reaction and response to it. And for a lot of us in the room, we have multiple of those sort of conditions. Being smart isn't necessarily the only way in which we're different from a lot of other people. So that makes things much more complex and potentially more challenging, let's say. So the last theory I'm going to cover you this morning is one slide only, so relax, it's very brief. It's by a woman named Marcia Linehan, who is living right now up in Seattle. And she talks about, she's actually borrowed this from kind of ancient wisdom traditions. But she talks about the mind as having two main components, what she calls rational mind and what she calls emotional mind. And she says that we tend to operate with both of these going on at the same time. And if you'll think back to the Carl Sagan video, he alluded to this a bit. He talked about the limbic system, where we physiologically process emotions and things. He talked about the cerebral cortex, where we do a lot of our thinking and more linear and rational and even intuitive type thought. So what Marcia Linehan says, that if you tend to either extreme, if you're way over here in the rational, then you're missing the boat to some extent, because you're not incorporating that other part of your brain. Or if you're way over here on the emotional, then you're really completely out of control. And as gifted folks, we tend to have a lot of both of these things. So she says the solution is to try to exist whenever possible at the intersection of these, which she calls wise mind. So trying to not ignore the potentials of either, but to incorporate both simultaneously in terms of
drawing from the strengths of both aspects of the mind in order to reach the wisest conclusions possible, or the wisest decisions possible in any moment. In this, she's saying that raw intelligence, which we often think of as the rational mind, is not the same thing as wisdom. And instead, wisdom would be the intersection of this intellect, or our intelligence, and our emotional mind. By unifying the two, she would say, is the seat of wisdom. If indeed wisdom resides at this intersection of our intellect and our emotions, then if we wish to be as wise as possible, we must know those aspects as well as we can. Psychotherapy can be a useful tool in that inner exploration. So I'd like to take a minute just to address a couple of myths and thoughts about therapy in general. There historically has been a certain stigma that psychotherapy is for people who are ill or inadequate, can't perform or function, quote, normally. Some people also don't think it's worth the trouble of rocking the boat or changing the status quo. However, in my experience, therapy can be a very useful tool in which to explore ourselves and discover more of who we are. However, the number one factor research has demonstrated in achieving successful outcomes is the rapport between a client and therapist. So for this population, it's extremely important to find a therapist who understands the nature and the particular challenges of being a gifted individual.
Very smart consumers, because you're often much more intelligent than the therapists or coaches that you may work with. So it's really important, if you're going to work with people, to find someone who understands what giftedness is about, or is open to being educated about that. Because your needs, I think as we'll see a little later on, are indeed specific and unique.
This is where we'll end the first part of the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. If you'd like to hear the rest of the presentation that was originally given at the 50th anniversary reunion of the Governor's Program for Gifted Children, please check parts 2 and 3 of this webcast. There will also be additional references for readings and for the video clips that you've seen at the end of part 3. Again, thank you for your attention. If you have any questions as a follow-up to listening to this, please feel free to contact me at the number, email address, or through the website listed. Thanks very much, and take care.